You're listening to the Onside Podcast, the podcast for innovation-driven entrepreneurship here in Atlantic Canada. I'm your host, Alex McCann, and this is Season 2, Episode 20, and our theme is Sustainable Futures. Today, our guest is Jen Angel, the CEO of Evergreen. She's a builder of community, momentum, and places that people love. Together with partners, Jen builds inclusive, sustainable places that attract people and investment, enhance resilience, and contribute to the well-being for all. In 2021, Jen was recognized as one of Atlantic Business Magazine's top 50 CEOs and the most powerful woman in Atlantic Canada in 2022. She recently received the Inaugural Wije'winen Allyship Award in 2022 from the Mi'kmaq Native Friendship Center. She is a co-founder of the annual Art of City Building Conference, bringing placemaking leaders from around the world to Halifax. Jen, thanks so much for joining us here on the Onside Podcast. We're glad that you've come back, and we'd love to hear a little bit more about you and what you're thinking about. And why don't we get started off for our guests who didn't hear you last time? Can you share a little bit about your background and who you are?
Yeah, sure, Alex. It's so great to be back. Thanks for the invitation. So I lead an organization called Evergreen, based in Toronto, but with a national mandate to build a better future through better public spaces. Before that, I was working with Develop Nova Scotia here in Halifax with a mandate very similar to build great public spaces and through that to contribute to the magnetism of Nova Scotia to attract people. An economic development crown corporation. I was born and raised in Halifax, went to university here, studied philosophy, and then did an MBA.
MBA philosopher.
MBA philosopher, marketing, philosophy, sort of a seller of ideas maybe. Mm-hmm. And then I, along the way, had sort of a side hustle in real estate. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so those things have kind of all converged in the work that I'm doing today, which is about kind of, as I said, building great public places for people that work hard for climate and for community. They build economy, and I think this is increasingly important. I think they can work hard for building stronger social connections that we really need to solve some of the bigger problems before us.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, we talked previously about kind of disconnection and loneliness and all these things. Before we dive down into those super deep kind of questions, so you're now at Evergreen. Formerly, you were here in Nova Scotia at Develop Nova Scotia, but you're at Evergreen now. And what is the mission of Evergreen? Like, what does Evergreen do?
Yeah, I mean, and I think it is sort of this simple. We are trying to build a better future through better public spaces. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Evergreen is unique because it operates at the intersection of public sector in that we steward significant public lands. So we kind of operate at this place where we can take risks and be innovative in the nature of the work that we do. And we also have the opportunity to do some of that experimentation in public lands in the public interest. So there's a trust that exists sort of across the sectors that I think is kind of unique and very powerful to make places work harder for community.
Awesome. Well, that's really interesting, the work that Evergreen is doing and kind of that intersection of the different partners that you mentioned. And I know that the work that you're doing is focused on kind of fostering really inclusive and innovative cities and places and things like that. And you guys have some work that you're doing around something called Future Cities. Can you tell our audience a little bit about what Future Cities is and what that is? What's that about?
Yeah, so it's a collection of programs primarily around convening folks, again, across sectors to work together thoughtfully to drive thinking around how we build cities of the future. And a lot of people's minds go immediately to technology in that context. And there is lots of work around tech, including an AI for cities tool that's actually on our website. That identifies heat sources in cities that can help be an aid for city planning. But it's as much about challenging the way we're doing things through in a broader sense. So, for example, one of the things that's very exciting, and it's emerged not only through our Future Cities convenings, but more generally, is the role of Indigenous-led or Indigenous co-governance frameworks in reimagining our approach to cities. So when we're now coming to the realization that we can't continue to extract from the planet and expect there aren't going to be impacts, and we're feeling acutely the impacts of climate change, of course. When we look to Indigenous communities who have lived for a very long time in this place and have stewarded it very well, I think there's a ton we can learn there. So when we're talking future cities, in some cases, we're talking about learning from something that's been around for a very long time, but with humility and not and challenging some of the assumptions that we've relied on for a very long time.
Interesting. So it's not all about creating this tech utopia city of the future where everybody's like riding around on self-driving cars.
The Jetsons.
The Jetsons. The Jetsons. It's really thinking about how do we create a sustainable future city environment where we all live and feel comfortable.
You got it. That's a great way to frame it. Yeah.
And technology is a part of that. We use that to help us, but it's not the only thing that's important there.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. I like that. And we've talked about this before, and we do some work here in Nova Scotia, kind of in rural communities, and thinking about how rural communities can get connected to some of these ideas and concepts. And, with the work that you're doing with future cities, are there any takeaways that rural communities could think about? Or
Yeah, so we're primarily focused on cities because the majority of population, I think 50% of the world's population live in cities, and over the next couple of decades, it's expected to grow to 70%. A lot of industry is centered in cities. So there are significant levers for change. So if we have to focus somewhere, that's an important place to focus. But I think the lessons apply in a rural context in many cases too. And I think you said it when you just sort of framed, the response to the last question. I think it's about when you're making infrastructure investments, make them work harder. Think about how this is going to shape how you move around, how you participate, what life looks like, what you're prioritizing. And I think what we're now faced with is actually undoing a lot of the things that we did within the last 50 years. And I think the Cogswell project in Halifax is a great example. So rather than sort of doing the things we know how to do well, like building roads, road builders are really good at building roads. So the question is not necessarily how to build roads differently. It's whether we should really be building those things at all.
Or if we are building the road, how is it servicing us? Like, what else can it do, or how else is it going to reach a community?
Sure. And I think challenging the communities we're building, because we are making very large investments in, new housing, for example. Do they need to be greenfield, or could we build greater density in our cities? And, this conversation is playing out in Toronto right now, too, and in lots of other places. And I think we're too quick to go out rather than go up. And, we're dealing with municipal budget challenges right now in Halifax, as cities are across the country. If you can build where services already exist and build density, that's a lot more cost effective and a lot more efficient long term too. So we're thinking about the life cycle cost of things, the responsibility to sustain them over time, which is often a public responsibility, which then gets passed on to the taxpayers to support, and they're contemplating a tax hike, as you know. So we need to respond quickly because the challenges are enormous and our population has been growing really quickly, but we can't use that pace as a cover for making bad decisions or old decisions. We know better now. We need to imbue our decisions with that experience and knowledge.
Yeah. We don't want to rush towards bad decisions with the urgency of just needing to make a decision.
Yeah.
We want to try to think through the problem and come up with long-lasting solutions because they will be there for a long time. It's interesting. I lived in Japan for 2 years. I lived in Nagoya, and I also lived in Osaka.
Nice.
And you think about densification. I think they've got densification like on lock.
Dialed, yeah.
Yeah. And, people live in a different way and adapt to their environment. And the same as New York or Toronto or other places. And it does sort of change the way that we live and connect with each other. But these things are all possible. And even in Halifax, I see we're starting to build up. When I first moved here, I did some volunteer work for our Urban Development Action Committee or something. I can't remember. And there was a lot of talk about densification, bringing things in because everything was just sprawling outwards. And I've been here for a while now, and it's nice to see that it's actually coming up. And then I think we'll be thinking about where's that going to go kind of next.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be, 50-story point towers.
Yeah.
Like, could be...
That may not make sense for us here.
No, and in some cases it might, but it isn't sort of the extreme. And folks who are advocating for greenfield development for sprawl, which can be a lot easier, are often sort of using that argument that people causes anxiety for people. It's going to be this concrete jungle and the downtown nature of the downtown is going to change. Again, like there's more nuance in it than that. And I think we need to be prepared to stand up on the other side and say, no, it doesn't have to look like that. And we know that if we build out, we are putting more cars on the road and we're contributing then to the problem of climate, not to the solution. And we need to start incentivizing and rewarding companies that are contributing to the solutions.
And I feel like there's a lot of interest and concern about that. I was going to ask about Brick Works, but I'll come back to that in a minute because I think you touched on climate. And there is a lot of focus now on climate mitigation and adaptation. It's on people's minds. And we just saw COP27, and now we have stuff going on in Montreal, and people are protesting. Some people are engaged. It's this is the season where there's a lot of thinking, and people are talking about climate emergency, climate anxiety. A lot of young people are worried they'll never be able to afford a house, or these kinds of things. What are some things that you're thinking about, as it sort of relates to climate adaptation and kind of the built environment? And you talked about incentivizing builders, and there's all these things like LEED and LEED certified buildings, and we talked about technology from future cities that can be embedded. I just was looking at my my power bill the other day, and I was like, oh my God, how much money are we spending just to plug things in? I was like, children, turn off all of these devices. Like, we're just using electricity for no reason. It's just being sucked in, and things are going up.
But I think that's exactly the point. We need to change behavior. And my first day at Evergreen, I almost missed because of Hurricane Fiona. I was to fly out Saturday morning. I ended up bumping it up I was actually gone by the time the storm hit. But Fiona was called by some a once-in-a-generation storm. I think it's the third or fourth I've experienced in the last 20 years. So these are things that are becoming very common. And so what I'm thinking about, frankly, is that the scale of the challenge before us is way bigger than I think people realize. I mean, so we're in Montreal. People are in Montreal now talking about biodiversity loss and collapse. And I'm just not sure we are sufficiently responding to the scale and complexity of the issue. I think we're arguing about, the carpet and the house is on fire.
I printed off the power usage because I got a family, we got 5 in the house, and just thinking about, saving money, how we're treating stuff. Can you please not wash clean clothes again for the 10th time because you're too lazy to put it away? This, we're using up water and power and all of these things, and kind of trying to connect it back to your everyday actions. And I think about that a lot as well because it is your own individual responsibility and your own individual everyday actions. I may not be in the position to plan a city or put things like that, but it is your individual decision of how many times you're going to wash your clean clothes as my kids.
And it's, some people say, well, my one choice is not going to, and I don't have to tell you that it is about a collection. But I also think it's about changing the conversation broadly about what is required. Like I think if we can get a population of people who appreciate the risk of the time we are in and the requirement for action, that will also create a climate where decision makers and policy setters and government will not have any choice but to act, even making the big, tough decisions that we need.
Hard decisions. Yeah. You're right. the once in a 100-year storm is like 3 times a year.
Yeah.
And if you live on a coast or desert or, well, pretty much anywhere, your things are burning more, it's drier, sea level rise, all of these kinds of things. And so it'll hit you eventually. Maybe it's not your turn for that, 5th hurricane or tornado or whatever, but it'll come.
Well, and it's disproportionately impacting countries who are not the main drivers of the problem. So, we're feeling it here. We're not feeling it to the extent of some parts of the world where, places are becoming virtually uninhabitable due to rise in temperature and other things. So, it's we need to work together to solve the problem, and it includes making difficult decisions. And I worry that we're not moving fast enough and we're not making big enough changes to sufficiently meet the scale and complexity of the challenge.
Yeah. Well, one of our previous guests was from a company called Drinkable. They focus on water sensing technology for pathogens, bacteria, make sure you have safe drinking water. And that was another thing that came up in that conversation as well, is that people are on the move, migrating because they don't have access to water because the climate is changing and the water holes, are drying up. And this has a ripple effect of what we're seeing. So big things to think about. Well, let's change gears a little bit. Another thing I know you're working on at Evergreen is you have this really amazing space called Brick Works, which is kind of right, I'm going to say it's in the center of Toronto, but it's like...
Sort of is, the Don Valley.
Yeah. And it's, I call it like a green space in Toronto. So tell us a little bit about what's going on there and what you're trying to kind of showcase that can happen there.
Yeah, so that site, exactly as you described, is adjacent the ravine system. So Canada's biggest city has this extraordinary green space that, with really courageous and visionary, I would suggest, leadership, was preserved. It's still... So the Brick Works was a former brick factory. The bricks were run down the river. The mud was harvested from the river, and the bricks were created there. So it's an industrial site that was recapitalized under the visionary leadership of the former CEO, Jeff Cape. And this adaptive reuse project has become and continues to become a demonstration site for how to build regenerative cities. And so the word was sustainable, de rigueur, for a long time, sustainability. I think we're now moving from something more than that. We want places not just to be sort of held, but to actually work hard to heal the environment. And so this is some of the stuff we're thinking about at the Brick Works, how to create a space that actually tests some of this emerging technology, some of the emerging thinking, including exploring Indigenous co-governance structures, and engage people, including governments, including not-for-profit, including private sector, to come together and challenge thinking about how to build cities. So it's already a well-loved public space in Toronto. It needs better accessibility. It needs enhanced programming. There's all sorts of things that are sort of low-hanging fruit to work through. But I think it's the bones of something, a really interesting idea. And again, it's about how to do cities differently.
So like a little model or showcase for things that cities or places might want to adopt, whether it's technology or I've been to the space, so you even have green spaces out with like different kinds of grasses that could be grown or, things like that.
Exactly. And it's a huge site for nature play. So it runs a lot of children's programming as well. And I think it is about how do we bring people together to sort of co-create solutions to some of these big problems before us. And we've been really lucky that we've been able to attract significant private sector investment to the challenge as well. And I do believe, to the tips of my toes, that the solutions that we need are not going to come from an order of government or from one particular organization. They really are going to come from us working together. across sectors and across communities. And I think this space is about bringing people together to dig into just that.
I love it. I love it. Well, for anyone who's listening, I highly encourage you to go to the Brick Works. It's a beautiful space, outdoor. I think I went maybe in the fall. I got to walk kind of along some of the trails that were there. I feel like it'd be even more beautiful kind of in the spring or summer, but it was still lovely with the change of the seasons. Well, one thing you talked about, or you mentioned, or I think you've talked about this a couple times, I heard you mention this, was around this idea of Indigenous co-governance. And, we've talked a lot about kind of equity and inclusion, and it's something at Onsite we're really interested in is this idea around inclusive innovation. Can you share with us a little bit about what you mean by Indigenous co-governance? Is this something new that you're trying at Evergreen, or?
Yeah, I don't think it's unique to Evergreen either. But so this idea of land ownership is pretty fraught. And I think what we're thinking about is how can we leverage our stewardship responsibility, which is through a land lease, to explore different ways of working together with Indigenous communities around land stewardship. So not about inviting Indigenous people to be on site under the terms of our lease, rather relinquishing control, exploring different ways to work together such that there isn't a power imbalance, that there is instead joint commitment to figure out different ways to do public land governance. So it's like it's early days and there's complexity, but I think it's pretty hard to center reconciliation or Indigenous program within a system of colonialism. So we're trying to explore what does it look like to actually what could a true co-governance structure look like?
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm interested in this. I'm involved with some work outside of my normal, day-to-day stuff where these are some of the ideas that we're thinking about is how to think about at a board level or other level. We're operating like this now because this is a structure that's been imposed on us. Do we have to operate like this? So what other way could we operate, and what makes sense of about how we want to show up? I think that's one thing that's been interesting about COVID and the reimagining and rethinking and all of that. And maybe that would have happened before, but I just think that there's this moment has happened where people said, yeah, this is not really working on a whole bunch of levels.
Right.
Now is the time. Take the opportunity now before it escapes and just try to do the work. Yeah. And kind of reimagine and think about that. So
and
I love that.
And try things and accept that you won't get it perfectly right, but it's sort of a journey. And I think that's kind of the connection to placemaking. Like it's really about you're never finished. It's a sort of hold hands, walk the path together with a commitment to trying and failing until we kind of get it right in service of the sort of outcomes related to environment and social justice that we know cities are a powerful lever for change in.
Yeah. I think that's such an important point because a lot of people are afraid to engage in some of this kind of work because they just don't want to get it wrong and they feel so much pressure. But if you don't take that first step,
nothing changes.
Nothing will change if you keep doing the same thing. And you have to put some action behind your intention. So if you intend to do something but you don't actually do it, then it doesn't change anything.
You make me think of this social scientist Ibram Kendi. So I was struck by something I read of his, which was there's no such thing as not racist. You're either racist or anti-racist. If you're not actively working to deconstruct the systems of racism, you're holding up the systems of racism. Yeah. And I think that's true likewise in reconciliation. Like hanging around and waiting for things to change because you're fearful of making a mistake or for whatever reason is contributing to the problem. There is no posture that is neutral.
Yeah. we talk a lot, or I do a lot of like systems change kind of work, and you're holding the problem in place.
Yeah, exactly.
It just stays there.
Yeah, I love that.
If you do nothing.
Yeah, I love that framing.
Yeah, I have that book. It's I got the full version.
Okay.
Of the How to Be an Anti-Racist.
Yes, that is.
I think there's a shorter version, which I was going to get for my kids, but I got the big one.
Okay.
And been slowly making my way through that, but a lot of really great takeaways.
Yeah. I've heard him on podcasts too. He's fabulous.
Yeah. For our podcast listeners, you can listen to that as well. And maybe I just have like a couple more questions.
Sure.
Because I'm so curious, and we're always, looking at ways to get more people involved in, some of the kind of work around placemaking and innovation and these kinds of things. What are some ways that young people or others, if they're interested in placemaking or sustainable futures or cities or things like that, what are some ways that folks could get involved? Or not young people, middle-aged people? I
mean, I think most municipal governments, as they're doing planning and development, are generally working harder at inclusive engagement programs. So I've seen some examples of that even in Halifax, where there's a real effort, there's a recognition that the old ways weren't cutting it, and there's a real effort to make opportunities like that more accessible, both in person and also online. But I also think, this is sort of a moment, as you began to describe sort of post-COVID in other ways, but it's a moment where the importance of place is really beginning to be understood in a way that it hasn't before. And as I said, it used to sort of be relegated to the stuff, the not real infrastructure stuff. Now I think it's becoming very central, and you hear a lot about place-based policy and place-based economic development strategy and the role of place in environment and in equity and inclusion by getting behind community. And that doesn't mean only municipal governments, but community organizations, community-led projects. So, because I would also say one thing I learned for sure in my time in Halifax managing and stewarding and developing significant public spaces is that it's the little stuff as much as the big stuff. And there's a lot you can do at a very grassroots level to improve your neighborhood. And when you get out and do it, you'll find that others will get out and do it too. Like pride of place is contagious. And you can organize some great placemaking interventions with very little money and just a bit of enthusiasm and commitment. And part of what Evergreen's also trying to do is build a really robust online toolkit that's open source that people can contribute to and take from any way they'd like. And my hope is we'll be able to also support some of that work through small community, like tactical grants over the coming years. So more to come. But I think you'll find if you put your ear to the ground a little bit, there's stuff happening in community already, and there's opportunities to get involved. And where you don't see one, start your own.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. You said start small, and we did a project where we helped. We worked with Volta and the Halifax Downtown Business Commission, Gritty to Pretty, Slate Asset Management. So outside of Volta, so Tech Accelerator, we got an inclusive innovation mural put up, and
it's beautiful.
It wasn't a lot of money, but it was kind of that what you were talking about with engaging people. We did a whole engagement session. It was kind of harder to do because some of it had to go online because of COVID. But Grant, who was on my team, led a lot of that work. And it was this engagement process and getting it up. And ironically, I had mentioned this mural, not that I'm an expert on this, but we wanted to kind of make innovation visible and accessible to anybody. And there's a person who cuts my hair at a skate shop. His name is Joel. And I mentioned this mural to him, and he got really interested in it. And he did some work and started to get involved with putting murals up on Quinpool.
Okay.
And so I did not put any murals up on Quinpool. I'm not taking any credit whatsoever. It was just something I mentioned to him in passing, and then I saw him again, and he said, he participated in that as well. And I was like, oh, this is great. People are taking pride in place and doing small things, not building the road, but doing small things to get things going.
But I actually love that example because winning in this work is a proliferation of community-led efforts to engage their neighbors and improve the place they live. We talk a lot about mental health and social isolation and other social determinants of health. And actually, we talk a lot about health. Let's speak more broadly. A lot of the social determinants of health relate to participation and belonging. And if you can use place as a touchstone to bring people together, it's such a powerful tool it's a multi-solver of problems. And I think, so it's exciting when it catches on.
Yeah. I'm really excited about all the murals that are all over. Yeah. I'd love to see more, like all over Nova Scotia. All over Nova Scotia would be great. And I have maybe one final question for you that we usually like to ask our guests, which is a little bit more around entrepreneurship, because we talk about that at Onside. And entrepreneurship, do you think nurture or nature?
Yeah, I think it's nurture. Absolutely. I think it's not in the code of DNA to be creative or not, to be curious or not. I think anybody has that capacity for curiosity, and which I think is a building block of innovation. I think that it's incumbent on us as leaders to ensure that every kid gets an opportunity to sort of develop those muscles and has the opportunity to experience different things and to be challenged in different ways. And schools do that a little bit. And I think public spaces can do that in ways that maybe schools can't because of their ability to bring really diverse people together. And oftentimes in a context of sort of celebration and recreation and like exploration. And so, I think it's 100%. I think it's 98% nurture.
Maybe a little kernel of nature in there.
Maybe there's some nature. You'll tell me I'm wrong. No. I don't know the research on this stuff.
I don't know the research either, but we've gotten like very different opinions on the show. So
interesting.
I'm always curious what people are saying. Well, this has been fantastic.
Yeah,
I've enjoyed having you here. If people want to learn more about you and Evergreen and what you're working on, what's the best way that they can connect?
Yeah, I have an email address. It's jangel@evergreen.ca, but I'm on LinkedIn. I actually think it's Jennifer Angel. And I'm on Twitter, Jen Angel NS, but I don't have very many followers.
Okay,
and I rarely
post.
You. I might start posting. I say that every year. I need to post some things. But I'd love to hear from people anytime. And I'd be with questions, but also love to hear what people are thinking about this stuff and what projects they're involved in. We're going to be looking sort of coast to coast to coast at how we can help get projects off the ground and help people bring community together. Bring whatever. We'll be a bit of a Swiss Army knife and bring whatever we can to help support projects.
I like that. I'll be looking for you at meetings with your Swiss Army knife.
Excellent.
And that's great. And I want to thank all of our listeners for tuning in. You can hear more about Onside and our work at onsidenow.ca. Go there to check out some indicators that we have from our Inclusive Innovation Monitor. And as we come to a close, we would like to thank Nova Scotia's Community, Culture, and Heritage. We're so grateful for your support in helping us to make our podcast. And stay tuned for future episodes. Thanks so much for joining.
Thank you.
This
has been
a Podstarter
production.